Hey everyone, I'm running out of time to do this before I head off this weekend, but so I'm gonna do some of this at work, it looks like. What fun. Alright, Chapter 15. McGraw and Dick Amberstam saw the empty husks of Pensionville against the sunset. McGraw was driving at 70 miles an hour up the highway from the coast. Dick clamped together the ends of his seatbelt. If I were a praying man— Pray anyway, McGraw said. His head was throbbing. He had told Dr. Leon there wasn't time to get the gash in his forehead stitched up. The cruiser bounced over the top of the hill and tore past the deserted church and store, its speedometer needle rising. McGraw switched on the headlights as he hit the straight stretch going west. The Ellicott house had been a graveyard of the happiness McGraw had seen in it on the day of Slally's party. Ellen Drake was beyond outcry or tears when the two policemen brought the little girl home. As Dick carried Slally upstairs with Ellen and Dr. Leon following him, Richard Ellicott had come downstairs, passing them without a word. He crossed the living room, slammed the screen door behind him, and walked out to the end of the lawn. McGraw had been standing at the screen door, watching Richard when the telephone rang. It was Mike at the police station. A woman had just come in and said that she saw a boy answering to Bentley's description walking along the Tysonville Road about half an hour before. McGraw steadied the cruiser at 85 miles an hour and turned on the red flasher. The police car hurtled through the dusk, its revolving glass dome crying havoc. Charlie Peavy parked Willie Bill's pickup truck on the road leading down to the stone-crushing works. He took the shotgun, got out, and closed the door quietly. He was cold-sober and insane with fantasy. He had watched the sun burning out in the west. The voice of his God told him to find the mountains of uncut, unpolished stones. Charlie knew where those heaps of jewels were. He walked down the road to Lewis Empson and Sons, graded rock and gravel. The stone yard was a miniature universe of lights. Large beacons beamed from the stark framework towers. Smaller lights sparkled as moving belts carried rocks to the tops of the towers, where it was dumped into crushers 40 feet below. There were street lamps standing among the piles of size-graded gravel and stone. Charlie stooped and ran across the parking lot. He slipped into shadow behind a one-story office building. He sat there, his back against the wooden wall, holding the shotgun between his legs. The noise of the grinders and crushers nearly deafened him, but to Charlie Peavy the din was the croon of a supernatural being that loved him. Slally saw yellow eyes staring at her in a dream. She tried to scream as she came awake, but she was mute. Ellen laid a folded skirt in one of her suitcases on Richard's bed. Her emotions were suffocated beneath a pall of despair. She crossed the hall and opened the door of Slally's room. "Try to sleep, darling," she said to the wide-eyed little girl. "Daddy's coming to take us home tomorrow." Dietrich Christine sat in the messy library of his house with the lights off. He looked through the windows at Richard standing at the end of his lawn in the moonlight. "So heavy is the world with you tonight, Prince Ombra," the old man muttered. "What you have done to this little girl shows, I think, how frightened you are to fight the boy. I now know what the girl is. If she cannot tell the story when this is over, I will do it. I think you are afraid that soon the boy will find the stone. Then you will have to confront him, as you confronted the greatest of his brothers in all the ages of the world." He took a handkerchief from his pocket, checked to make sure it was the right one, and blew his nose. Prince Ombra's essence hovered in the uplands, where his enemy stood, frightened and alone. "I hear you, magician," Ombra whispered, "but you are old and do not understand. There are no mortals remaining worthy of calling themselves brother to David, Arthur the King, and Susano. I fear nothing. I will never meet this crippled whelp in combat. Tonight he will go obediently to his death." "Sorcerer, sorcerer, you do not even know the name of the last chosen warrior who perished at my hand. You only remember the calamities that came after he and his rememberer died. When this night is done, old magician, you will see such a burning of the world that you will yearn for the sorrows of your youth." Dietrich Christine could not hear him. Through the library windows he could see the aurora borealis wreathing again, like smoke in the northern sky, its tendrils the pastel colors of glacier ice. Dr. Christine turned his head and looked at the television set in the corner. He liked the symphony orchestra program, but announcers kept interrupting with news bulletins about the distant war, hotlines chattering across the world's darkness, and all the other symptoms of a crisis the old man could have foretold. He had finally switched off the set in disgust when a voice broke into a Brahms concert with the news that the president would address the nation within 24 hours. "So," he said softly, settling himself more comfortably in his chair, "now we will see what we will see." Bentley watched until he couldn't see the ospreys any longer, until their bodies blurred into the evening and the rising of the moon. His hawks were gone. He turned and looked up at Indian Hill. Suddenly the slope seemed too steep for his tired legs to climb. His chances of following the bobcat's instructions and finding the stone seemed suddenly remote. He knew he couldn't win even if he did find it. His will was gone, too. He went over to a picnic table standing on the grass. He sat down on the bench. He looked north and saw the aurora borealis. Somewhere in the distance Bentley could hear the sounds of the earth-moving machinery. He was scared. Now that he'd lost his magic, all that remained of his divine mission was the memory of where he had lived before he was born. The memory reproached him. He didn't deserve it because he'd let Ombra steal the stone of Ra that 1,000 heroes had carried in the world. Now Bentley was ordinary, just like everybody else. He itched in his dirtiness. He ached all over. He was ashamed of being frightened. The moon rode above the hills and forests. Its silver shivered on the surface of the lake. Bentley thought he could see the light of Stonehaven beyond the last row of hills, but he wasn't sure. He wished he was home. The only difference between him and everybody else was that he had his memories, and he knew what made all the bad things happen in the world. Other people didn't. Giving up when you knew something important that hardly anybody else knew was, he suddenly realized, letting down the whole world. He got off the bench. Memory of the perfect place he'd been before he was born brightened in him. He raised his head in the moonlight. They wanted him to remember. He felt what every mortal can feel if he chooses to acknowledge it, the eternal warmth of hope. Bentley put his right foot on the bench and retied the sneaker's lace tightly. He crossed the grassy place and began to climb Indian Hill. His heart was lighter. Maybe, he thought, he could still win. Elias Cutter finished writing. He picked up 2 sheets of paper and read them in the lamplight. "I'm not a lawyer, of course," he said, "but I believe this is the proper form." Mrs. Talley got up from her chair and crossed Mr. Cutter's library. She took the papers from him. She stood in front of his desk reading the citizen's complaint against Polly Woodhouse he had composed. As she read, Mrs. Talley suppressed the knowledge that she had thought Steve Slattery was a nice, decent young man. "I'd say this will do the job very nicely," she said, handing the sheets back across the desk. For a moment she saw the loneliness in Elias Cutter's eyes, and had to resist the impulse to take him home and give him supper. She repeated to herself the old saw about people who've made their beds and have to lie in them. "I expect they'll call off the search for the Ellicott boy in the morning," Mr. Cutter said. "I'll go along at lunchtime and give this to McGraw." "How is he?" Mrs. Talley asked. "He took a nasty crack on the head," Mr. Cutter said. "It didn't seem to slow him down much. The man's a plow horse." Mrs. Talley stood in Elias Cutter's driveway for a moment after he'd closed the door behind her. The undeniable truth that she'd thought Steve Slattery, a rapist, was suitable for Polly wouldn't go away. But it didn't persuade Mrs. Talley to relent. She just got angrier at the slut who'd made her so unhappy. She dismissed the notion that if she'd been mistaken about Steve, she might also be mistaken about Polly. She got into her car. Resisting self-doubt was her only comfort. She worked hard at getting angrier as she drove home. The anger gave her a savage pleasure. She could hardly keep from bursting into tears.